Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters in Islam, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shower His mercy and blessings upon all of you. And may He send His obedient servants from amongst the angels to come and hover above this gathering in which we will be discussing some of the methods and techniques and the methodology for investigating and verifying the authenticity of historical narrations. First thing that the scholars have mentioned is investigation of the chain of narration. Many of the books of history, they contain chains of narrations. And we talked previously about what is the chain of narration. We said it is the narration or the chain of narrators connected all the way from, for example, the author of the book, all the way up to the one who either saw the occurrence or heard the occurrence or witnessed the occurrence. As such. So we talked about the chain of narration and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed the Muslims with the chain of narration and how the religion of Islam has been preserved with the chain of narration. And one practical example of that is the Quran. The Quran has a chain of narration. It starts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who taught the Quran to Jibreel, who taught it to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who then taught it to the companions, who then taught it to the tabi'een, who then taught it to the atba' tabi'een, generation after generation, until it has reached us unaltered and unchanged 1438 years later. And as you know, those of our brothers and sisters who memorize the Quran, a lot of them attain an ijazah, the permission to teach or narrate the Quran from their teacher, and this chain is connected all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all the way back to Jibreel, all the way back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is an example of a chain of narration. Also what we find in the books of Hadith, for example, there might be a student of knowledge or scholars who learned, for example, Sahih Bukhari. They learned Sahih Bukhari from their sheikh in the year 2017. So his teacher learned it from his teacher, who learned it from his teacher, who learned it from his teacher, all the way back to the original author, Imam al-Bukhari, Sayyid al-Muhaddithin. So there is a chain of narration that he has with that book. So anyways, when we look, the first thing that we should keep in mind when we look into the books of history in specific is to investigate the chain of narration. And historical narratives will either be of two types, brothers and sisters. Those that are mentioned with chains of narration and those that are mentioned without chains of narration. So if they contain a chain of narration, then we must research and study the chain. And if it passes the test, then we move on to investigating the text itself. But normally, and in the majority of cases, if the chain of narration is found to be authentic, then there is no need to move on investigating the text. And the chain, number one, the chain of narration must be found to be connected. Must be a connected chain. See, it must be a connected chain. It must be a connected chain. There must not be any breaks in the links. And the narrators must be trustworthy. And at the same time, there must not be any narrations that are contrary to this narration or stronger or more authentic than it. And this is called something which is called Shaz in the sciences of Hadith. And also it must not have any hidden defects. There must not be any ilal in it. There must not be any hidden defects in it. And this is because the chain of narration, brothers and sisters, the chain of narration acts as the actual witness and proof of the occurrence. The chain of narration acts as the proof of the occurrence and the happening itself. And when the chain is broken, or there is a missing link in the chain, then this means that there is a missing narrator or missing witness. And this means that someone in the chain wasn't present. So the way that we would go about researching and investigating and examining the chain of narration, not only in books of history, but also if you wanted to apply this to books of hadith. But here we're talking about historical narrations in particular. So first thing is by investigation using the principles of the scholars of Jarh wa Ta'dil. The principles that the scholars of Jarh wa Ta'dil have derived from many sources. So you would use their principles first. Then using and considering the statements of the scholars of Jarh wa Ta'dil in regards to the narrators. Third step would be to establish that each narrator met the one whom he heard it from. Or there has to be a possibility of them meeting, meaning one might have lived in Hagerstown and one might have lived in Baltimore during the year 2017. So there is a possibility that they could have met, but you're not sure that they actually did meet. So if the possibility of them meeting is present, then you should establish that and make sure that there is a possibility of them meeting as well. And keeping in mind, brothers and sisters, that the historical narratives, they do not carry the same level of scrutiny as that of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is something very important to keep in mind, that the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they are on the highest level of scrutiny, the highest level of examination and verification, and striving hard to distinguish which are authentic and which are not authentic. And for this reason, we find that many of the scholars of Islam, they would be a little bit more lenient when transmitting and accepting historical narratives. And it's been narrated that Imam Ahmed, he said that when we relate or when we narrate or when we transmit narrations from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in issues related to halal and haram, then we would be very careful and have extreme scrutiny in investigating the chains of narration. But if we narrated from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in fada'at, in virtues and merits and issues that do not involve a ruling or legislation, then we would have less scrutiny in investigating the chains of narration and would be a little more lenient in what we narrated. So how do we understand this statement of Imam Ahmed rahimahullah? The ease and the leniency that he intended here in narrating historical narratives, right? He was talking about hadith, but let's take this in regards to historical narratives, because similarly the scholars were a little more lenient and were a little more easy in their transmitting of historical narratives. So this can be understood from two aspects, brothers and sisters. The first is in regards to the status and characteristics of the narrators. Okay, the status and characteristics of the narrators. For example, this narrator was tall, this narrator was short, this narrator had a long nose, this narrator had a full beard. This narrator, he was from this tribe, he was from that tribe. Also from the aspect of their preciseness or inattentiveness, or whether he was unknown or not spoken about with any disparagement, criticism, or praise. So that was one aspect in which they would be a little more lenient in regarding. Secondly, the leniency and the ease would be in regards to the connection of the chain, right? And when we look into the historical narratives and we look into the books of history, we find that the majority of them are either mursal, okay, munqati', mu'dal, or mu'allaq. They are normally of these four types. And these are normally not accepted by the scholars of hadith. These are normally not accepted by the scholars of hadith, and they are considered in the category of hadith which are considered to be weak, because they have breaks in the chain and there are some missing narrators in the chain, some in the beginning of the chain, some in the end of the chain, some in the middle of the chain. So normally these hadith are not accepted by the scholars of hadith. Four different types, okay? Four different types of narrations in which we find the majority of the historical narrations fall into these categories: mursal, munqati', mu'dal, and mu'allaq. And one thing we need to keep in mind, brothers and sisters, is that this ease and leniency that was shown to historical narratives, and that we see that some of the historians used in their books, it wasn't absolute. Okay, it wasn't absolute, where they would be ease and lenient in everything that they narrated. And nor did it include all the historical narratives. This is very important to understand. It didn't include all the historical narratives. Rather, they are specific. Okay, the leniency and ease, okay, was specific for narratives that mentioned the description of the towns and cities. For example, Hagerstown. Hagerstown is an old city. The Battle of Antietam took place here. There were many casualties in the Civil War. It's a very green city. A lot of farms, a lot of corn is grown there. A lot of wheat and soybeans are grown there. You have farms. You have cows. You have sheep. You have old houses which are made of stone. These are kinds of descriptions of the towns and cities. So these are the type of narrations and the narratives that many of the scholars of history would be very easy and lenient in speaking about and mentioning in their books. Also the battles and conflicts, okay? The battles and conflicts that took place, because when you narrate or transmit information that was relayed to you about a battle or a conflict, you have to keep in mind that there's many different situations and many different occurrences going on, many different conflicts, right? So you're going to have many different narratives and different types of stories. Also, they would be lenient and easy in describing the environment, the political situation, as well as the social aspects of certain places, where they would say, the people there were very social, they were very talkative, they were very laid back and secluded. They used to cook this kind of food. They used to cook kebsa. They used to cook mendi. They used to cook this and that. Talking about the food that they would eat, kind of the food that they would cook, the fruit trees that would be there, the vegetables that they would grow, and some of the other aspects relating to the social aspects and the political aspects of the place that they were describing or talking about in the books of history. So in these particular issues, this is where we would understand that they would be very lenient and easy in. But as for the narratives regarding creed, or the halal and haram, or the legislations and rulings, for example, upon certain individuals, or clarifying the correct position or the correct stance in times of fitna, trials and tribulations, and especially what occurred during the time of the companions and the tabi'een, then in these cases, one must never be lenient. One must never show ease into investigating and accepting the chains of narrations. And one must do extra research and be more scrutinous and cautious than any other issues, while at the same time implementing the conditions of accepting or rejecting the narration, just as he would do what? Just as he would do in the study of hadith. So the second principle, brothers and sisters, is investigating the text. Okay? Remember, we talked about the books of history, historical narrations will either be of two types. Some will contain chains of narration, others will not contain chains of narration. So then, if the text doesn't have a chain of narration, then we go directly to the text, no matter if it has a chain of narration or not. But if the chain is weak, if the chain of narration is weak, if the text has a chain of narration and we find it to be weak, then there is no need at all to research and study the text. But if the chain is acceptable, then the majority of the time the text is acceptable, as well if it is free from, as long as it is free from conflicting narrations that are more authentic than it, or if you have, for example, one historical narration talking about one particular instance, but then you have 10 other narrations which are all in agreement conflicting this narration, this could be considered something which the scholars call Shaz, which is an odd narration. And also we have to be sure that the historical narration is free from hidden defects. So if the text, if the historical text has no chain of narration at all, as many of the historical narratives are in the books of history, as many of the later scholars who compiled books of history, such as Ibn Kathir, such as Ibn Athir, such as some of the later scholars, a lot of them sometimes would remove some of the chains of narration from their books just to make it easier just to make it easier for the reader. So if the chain of narration in these books of history is omitted and is not there, then the investigation and scrutiny will be directed where? Directly to the text. Okay, you will look and try to research and study the text immediately. And many of the scholars have exerted their endless efforts to examine, scrutinize, and criticize the text contained in the books of history as well as in the books of hadith. And normally the scholars consider the narration to be acceptable if it is free from hidden defects, free from ilal, and free from shaz, from shadud, and free from any contradictory or conflicting narrations. Imam Muslim, one of the great scholars who authored his book Sahih Muslim and many other books, he has a book in which he mentions many of the principles used to scrutinize the mutun, used to scrutinize the texts. And this book is called At-Tamyiz, in which he mentions many important principles that the student of knowledge and the scholar and the researcher needs to know and understand to be able to scrutinize and investigate the mutun, the texts. As well as Imam Ibn Jawzi. Imam Ibn Jawzi in his book Al-Mawdu'at, he mentions also many important principles and qawa'id in which the researcher and student of knowledge can utilize when he goes to study the authenticity of text. Also Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, he has a great book called Al-Manar al-Manif fi al-Sahih wal-Da'if. Al-Manar al-Munif fi al-Sahih wal-Da'if, in which he mentioned about 13 principles. He mentioned about 13 principles to recognize if a hadith is fabricated or if a hadith is mawdu'. And some of the principles that he mentioned, inshallah we'll mention some of them, and you guys can get your pen and paper and write these down. These are very important, inshallah, when you study hadith and also when you open up the books of history and you want to look to see the authenticity and verify and examine the authenticity of historical narration. The first principle that is mentioned is placing the narration in front of the Quran. Ard al-riwaya ala Quran. Right? Is placing the narration in front of the Quran. You have the narration, the historical narration in front of you, and then you research in the Quran to see if there's anything in the Quran that is conflicting with this historical narration or is contradictory to the historical narration. Okay? And if the historical narration is contradictory to something in the Quran, then of course you would give precedence to the narrative that is in the Quran over the historical narration. But at the same time, maybe you would have to do further investigation of that historical narration. Secondly, is placing the narration, right? Placing the narration in front of the other narrations and the hadith, the authentic hadith. So if you have one historical narration from Muawiyah, and then you would take that and compare it to the authentic hadith you have regarding the issue. But not only take the historical narration of Muawiyah, but take the historical narration from Ali, take the historical narration from Ibn Abbas, from Ibn Mas'ud, from Aisha, from the rest of the companions, and then compare them and contrast them and place them in front of the hadith, the authentic hadith, and derive your conclusion and ruling from gathering the text together and understanding them together collectively. Third principle is observing the practices. What is the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Take the historical narration and compare it and contrast it with what is the known sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So normally, if the historical narration is against or conflicts with the known sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then this should draw up some yellow lights of caution to do some further investigation into that historical narration. The next principle is contrasting and comparing the narration to what has occurred in history with proved documentation. For example, if you have one historical narration, but you have 500 other books from different resources which say that this event occurred. The historians in China reported, the historians in Africa reported, the historians in Turkey reported, the historians in Europe reported it, and everybody else throughout the world reported this, but you have one historical narration that says that no, this didn't occur. Then this would give more weight to the majority of those historians who narrated it, and you would leave off that one historical narration. Another thing to how to recognize if a hadith is weak or if a historical narration is weak is if the wording, right? Ar-rakaka fi lugha. The wording in the narration or the wording in the hadith is weak. Because we know, first of all, when we talk about the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed upon the tongue of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon the heart of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was from the most eloquent of speakers. He used the best of words, the best of speech. So sometimes when you hear, and this shows us and this tells us and reminds us about the importance of studying Arabic, brothers and sisters, the importance of studying nahu and sarf and memorizing vocabulary and memorizing Quran, so you can understand the usloob of the Arab and understand the usloob of the Quran and understand the usloob of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the context and the different phrases and ways that they used to speak to each other. So for the one who has a good background in the Arabic language, sometimes when he reads the text of the hadith, this can sometimes give off some yellow lights that the hadith may be fabricated or the hadith may have a problem in it. And the last principle, one of the last principles that the scholars mention, is that if the historical narration contradicts the general principles of the Sharia, if you find that the historical narration contradicts or conflicts with the general principles of the Sharia, then you need to do some further investigation, and this should also give off some yellow lights that you should be cautious and do some further examining. And the last principle is that the narration, right, if the historical narration contains something denounceable, something which all of the Muslims have denounced, or something which is impossible. So these are just some of the principles that the scholars have mentioned, and specifically Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah in his book Al-Manar al-Munif fi Sahih wa Da'if, in which he mentioned about 13 principles on how to distinguish whether a hadith is authentic or inauthentic. But we can also use these principles as well when we study and look into historical narration. So, brothers and sisters, investigation and examining of the texts alone, now we're talking about historical texts, can be done by the following footsteps and guidelines. Okay? Can be done by following the following footsteps and guidelines. First of all, compare all the texts related to the same issue. Okay? For example, now you want to read about what happened in the Battle of Siffin, for example, or the Battle of Al-Jamal, or you want to hear or read about what happened in the Battle of Badr or the Battle of Uhud. Gather up all the books. First, gather up verses from the Quran. Gather up the books of tafsir. Gather up the books of hadith. Then gather up the books of seerah. Okay, and the books of history. First, the books of history with the chains of narration. Okay, gather up all these different resources, okay, related to that same particular issue. For example, the Battle of Badr. And then you will get a clear picture. When you understand the issue completely, you will get a clear picture of what actually took place and know some of the fine details that took place. So first, compare all the texts related to the same issue. And when doing so, right, sometimes you have historical narrations. This historical narration has added wordings. This historical narration has missing wordings. And the added words and the missing words will become apparent only when you gather all of the texts related together. And similarly with hadith. Okay? And also the narrator, the one narrating in the chain, the one who had made a mistake, and the one who is more trustworthy and more precise in his narrating, this will also become clear as well. So the researcher and the student of knowledge must exert all of his research skills in gathering up as many narrations as he can related to the topic at hand. And Imam Muslim, rahimahullah, he mentions in his book At-Tamyiz that he says, when the narrations are gathered and compared and scrutinized together, only then are the weak distinguished from the strong narrations, and only then are the weak narrators known from those who were precise and strong in the narration. So, and also many of the other scholars says that if you don't gather the hadith from 30 different routes of transmission, then you will never understand the hadith. So similarly, when we deal with historical narrations as well, brother, if you want to understand anything related to history, or you want to study a certain topic in history, then you must strive hard to gathering up as many texts you can related to the issue. Okay? Another thing is that the text must also be free in itself from contradictions. For example, you might have in the beginning of the text, the text might be 2 sentences, but in the first sentence it's establishing something, but in the second sentence it's negating the same thing that established in the first part of hadith. So, all right, the text must be free from contradictions in itself. Third thing that the scholars mention is contrasting and comparing the text to authentic historical occurrences to see whether if it is in agreement or disagreement. And an example of this is what Imam Zahabi mentioned about the biography. When Imam Zahabi, he compiled the biography of Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, who died in the year 463 after the hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He mentioned, Imam Zahabi mentioned about the biography, in the biography of Khatib al-Baghdadi, that some of the Jews who were in Baghdad, who were living in Iraq, living in Baghdad at that time, the time of Khatib al-Baghdadi, they presented a book. They presented a book to one of the ministers, to one of the leaders, one of the governors and mayors in Baghdad, mentioning that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam removed the jizya, removed the tax from the Jews, meaning that the Jews didn't have to pay tax anymore. That the Prophet removed the tax from the Jews of Khaybar, and that there were some companions who witnessed this as well, and their names were written or signed on the document. So the minister of Baghdad, he brought this to Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and he presented it to him. And Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi responded, he said, "This document is forged. This document is fabricated." And the minister was surprised. He says, "Well, how do you know?" He said, Khatib al-Baghdadi replied, he says, "It contains the testimony of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan." And Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, he accepted Islam in the year of Fath Mecca. When was that? That was after Khaybar. And it also contains the testimony or the signature of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, who died 2 years before Khaybar. So we see here the scholars of Islam, and specifically the scholars of Hadith, what would they use to detect liars? They would always use history. And it was from their extreme and extensive knowledge of history in which they could differentiate between the fabricated hadith, the fabricated historical narrations, the fabricated documents, and the authentic documents. So another thing that the scholars mention is that the text containing something impossible or something that is denounced, and we mentioned that previously. Also, what would the scholars do? They would examine the handwriting. The scholars would know by looking at the handwriting of a particular document or book and looking at the phrases and words and sentences that were used, they would know and they could determine when this book or this document was written, how it was written, what type of ink was used to write it, what type of paper it was on. So every time, every era, and every place had their own specific features and ways of writing and documenting information. This also included the examining of the date and the time of writing the document, as well as the type of ink, whether the ink was colored or whether the ink was black. Normally the colored ink, the red ink that when you look at some of the manuscripts, the red ink is used in the later generations, after the 5th century, 4th century, 6th century, right? Normally, the earlier manuscripts, it was only black ink that was used. They also look at the different types of handwriting. Was it naskh? Was it raqa'? Was it the Moroccan way of handwriting? They would also examine the types of paper as well. So these were some of the tools and some of the techniques and methods that not only the scholars of hadith knew about, but also the historians as well. Another principle that is very important to mention is having knowledge of the different levels and statuses of Islamic resources and books. Many of the books of history mention only historical occurrences or descriptions of the countries and cities and description of the inhabitants of those cities and countries. Other books of history mention biographies and narrators and tabaqat and their different levels and statuses according to the scholars of hadith and according to how close they were to their teachers. And there should be specific, this is very important, there should be specific categorization of the different types of Islamic resources. Okay? Starting off, number one, with the most authentic and trustworthy resources first. Okay? For example, the Quran, the Sunnah, the books of Sahih, for example, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, all the authentic, for example, books of history with all the authentic chains of narration. And our Sheikh, Sheikh Al-Allama, Sheikh Muhammad Nasr al-Din al-Albani, he actually had a compilation called Sahih al-Sirah. He worked on a compilation called The Authentic Narrations regarding the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is a project that some of the students and some researchers should work upon. Go through, gather up the books of history and purify them from all of the weak and inauthentic narrations so we can preserve our Islamic heritage and preserve our Islamic history. So first of all, the most authentic resources and books, they should take precedence. They should be first in line. And also the known sources and the known authors before the unknown authors, right? You should take the books in which the authors are known before reading or studying books where the authors are unknown. Secondly, arranging the resources according to their methodologies of compilation and organization. For example, some books were just a compilation of previous resources and books. For example, the great book by Ibn al-Athir, for example, Jami' al-Usul, in which he gathered up many of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and categorized them according to their specific topic. So his book is a compilation of the hadith contained from the 6 books of hadith. So some books were just a compilation of previous resources, and other books were summarizations of previous resources, while others were compilations gathered from previous resources that contain criticisms and examination of those resources with commentary and discussion. So you have different types of books, brothers and sisters. And that's very important, that the student of knowledge should familiarize himself with the different types of books, the different topics and themes and subjects related to each book. And is the book, right, a masdar al-ra'isi or masdar far'i? Is it, and for example, an original resource in which you go back to, or is it a resource which was compiled later on and the author compiled it and benefited from earlier scholars? Another thing that the scholars mention is that the books that were authored, okay, and this is particular and regarding to hadith, but today we're talking about historical narrations. The books that were authored during or closer to the time of occurrence of the happening are given precedence to those that were authored what? Later on. Next thing the scholars mentioned is arranging the books according to their topics. Okay? The care and concern for the particular subject. For example, if you wanted to study bid'ah, for example, you wanted to study about innovations. Okay? What book would you go to? First, open up the books of hadith. Okay? Open up the books of hadith. For example, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan Abi Dawood, Sunan Nisa'i, Sunan Ibn Majah, Musnad Imam Ahmed, Sunan Ad-Darimi. Okay? Look in these books, explore these books, and open up the chapter which talks about innovations. But then, if you wanted to, for example, study innovations in particular, then you have specific books which were compiled talking only about that particular topic, such as bid'ah. For example, we have, Kitab al-Bid'ah. Kitab al-Bid'ah by Ibn Waddah al-Qurtubi. Ibn Waddah al-Qurtubi, who was from amongst the earlier scholars who died in the year 199 after the hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he mentions, when he talks about innovations in bid'ah, he brings the chains of narration. So this is a book which talks about bid'ah, and it is musnada. Musnada, it brings his chains of narration all the way back to those who he heard it from. Then we have, for example, another book, okay, Al-Raddu ala Mubtadi'ah. Al-Raddu ala Mubtadi'ah by Abi Ali Hassan ibn Ahmed ibn Abdullah al-Ma'ruf bi ibn al-Banna al-Hanbali. Right? He died in the year 471. He also, the way he compiled his book, it is compiled into chapters and fusul, but it is not a book, right? Some of the narrations he brings contains chain of narration. Then, for example, you want to come to some later scholars. For example, Al-Ibda'u fi Madar al-Ibtida', another book about innovations. And then you have Mukhtasar Kitab al-I'tisam. And I'tisam, the book Al-I'tisam by Imam al-Shatibi, this is one of the most important books to study for anybody who wants to learn about innovations and the principles and qawa'id and dawabit of how to recognize and how to deal with innovations and how to deal with innovators as well. So this book, this is a mukhtasar. This is a summarized version of Al-I'tisam, a summarized version of Al-I'tisam. So just how I said, there are different types of books, and each one has their particular topics. And then there are many, many books as well. For example, you have the book here, which was also, right, Kitab al-Hawadith wal-Bid'ah. This was authored by Imam Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn al-Walid al-Tartushi, who died in the year 530. So if I wanted to study or learn about bid'ah, then I wouldn't just take one book and run with it and start talking about innovations and innovators. I would read all of these books so I could have a complete and greater and deeper understanding about innovations, innovators, how to deal with them. So, arranging the books according to their topics, brothers and sisters, and their care and concern for a particular subject. For example, Imam al-Bukhari, for example, his book is what? Called Sahih al-Bukhari. Imam Bukhari memorized hundreds of thousands of hadith. He memorized hundreds of thousands of hadith, many hundreds of thousands of hadith. He memorized hadith which were authentic and hadith which were what? Inauthentic and weak, according to his conditions and according to his standards. But when he compiled his book as Sahih, he had a certain methodology and he had a certain way of compiling his book, and he had certain conditions. He says, I'm only going to place authentic hadith in this book. So, and many of the other scholars as well had particular topics and particular subjects and compiled books, particular topics. For example, another book that Imam Bukhari compiled is Al-Adab al-Mufrad. Adab al-Mufrad, which talks about all of the hadith and all of the narrations from the companions, which he gathered and which he placed in his book regarding etiquettes and manners. So if somebody wanted to know about etiquettes and manners, he would refer back to that book. Also, brothers and sisters, another important topic is knowing the dates that books were written. Okay, knowing the dates that books were written. Not different books, not different authors, different books by the same author. For example, let's take Imam Dhahabi, for example. Imam Dhahabi, he has numerous compilations. Okay? He has Al-Kashif, which talks about the biographies of the narrators in the Kutub al-Sitta, in the 6 books of Hadith. He has Al-Mughni, which talks about some of the weak narrators. He has Sir A'lam al-Nubala. He has many other books, numerous amount of books regarding biographies. So now, you might open up Sir A'lam al-Nubala, and he might talk about a particular individual in Sir A'lam al-Nubala and say that his narrations, for example, are weak. But then you open up Kashif and you say that his narrations, he says that his narrations are Hasan. And then you open up Mughni and it says that his narrations are weak. So this brings us and shows us the importance of knowing, well, which book did Imam Dhahabi author first? Was it Mughni? Was it Al-Kashif? Was it Sir A'lam al-Nubala? So then you will know and see how, for example, the ijtihad changed according to time, and according to when those books were authored. Also, and another very important thing, brothers and sisters, is knowing the reason as to why the author compiled the book. Okay? Knowing the reason as to why the author compiled the book. And this aids us in appreciating and valuing the book that we're studying. Some authors, for example, have gathered their books or compiled their books for discussion and debate. For example, there are some scholars who put together books about, for example, joking. Other scholars, for example, just writing down their thoughts. Like, for example, Ibn Jawzi, Sayyid al-Khatir, who compiled a book about his thoughts, kind of like a diary that he would write. He would be thinking and pondering about so many different things and write down his thoughts. Other scholars compiled books for debate. Others for summarization. For example, this author, he summarized the book Al-I'tisam. He summarized the book Al-I'tisam, which is about 3 or 4 volumes. He summarized it into one small volume. Others compiled books for memorization. Such as the books of Hadith, for example, the 40 Hadith of Imam Nawawi, or Usul al-Thalatha, or Qawaid al-Arba', or these type of books. Others compiled books to distinguish between the authentic hadith and the inauthentic hadith, or authentic historical narratives or inauthentic historical narratives. So, brothers and sisters in Islam, we mentioned previously that it's very important to not only know the reasons and causes as for why these scholars compiled their books, but also knowing the methodologies of the authors in their techniques and methods to compile their books. How did they do it? Why did Imam Bukhari make this chapter heading and put this hadith under this chapter? Why did Imam Muslim gather so many different chains of narration under this chapter heading? Right? Knowing the techniques and the methods as to how the great scholars compiled their books. So the majority of scholars, they followed the methodology, okay? They followed the methodology of first gathering the information. This is what the scholars of hadith would do. And many of the earlier scholars, they would go and listen to the mashayikh, to the scholars in their vicinity, in their city. And once they finished studying with the scholars and gathering up all the knowledge that they could and learning and studying and sitting at the knees of the scholars in their area, then they would move on to neighboring and other cities and countries to go seek knowledge as well. So first they would gather their hadith and gather their knowledge from the scholars. Then that would be the first step, gathering. And then they would what? Then they would filter out. They would filter out some of the weak things, or some of the weak narrations, or some of the weak historical narratives, or some of the information that they didn't want to be publicized, or they didn't want to share with others. They wanted to keep it personal for themselves. So they would filter and then categorize what they gathered according to their specific methodology and conditions that they set. And as we mentioned earlier, Imam Bukhari memorized hundreds of thousands of hadith, but he memorized some which were weak and some which were authentic. And he only chose the best of the best for Sahih Bukhari. And he also had other authentic hadith as well that he didn't mention in Sahih Bukhari. So each scholar had their own methodology, right, and their own way of categorizing the hadith or the historical narrations that they mentioned in their books. Also, for example, another thing to pay attention to